I'm Itamar Rabinovich. I'm the former Israeli ambassador to Washington, former chief negotiator with Syria, former president of Tel Aviv University, and now back to academic life.
What is diplomacy? There are numerous definitions. We believe that diplomacy goes far beyond theoretical explanations. And to truly understand, we turn to the memoirs of the experts. Today we welcome Ambassador Itamar Rabinovich, former Israeli ambassador to the US. Ambassador, welcome to Vienna.
Thank you.
To the capital of diplomacy, as many people say.
Yeah, we always remember Metternich very fondly.
We are today in the first district at a very special cafe too, because we have the Viennese coffee culture. And we thought maybe we can also share something about Vienna while doing this kind of interviews, these memoirs about important personalities. But let's begin by discussing your background. Could you tell us more where you come from? Where did you grow up?
Yeah, I was born in Jerusalem in the middle of World War II. My family moved to Tel Aviv after our War of Independence. I grew up in the Tel Aviv region. I studied Middle Eastern history and world history, first at the Hebrew University and then at Tel Aviv University and finally at UCLA, where I got my PhD. I did 6 years of military service. I was an analyst in Israeli military intelligence. Once I completed my PhD, I had a position with Tel Aviv University in 1971. And since then I've been with the university, but for 4 years, during which I worked for Yitzhak Rabin and his government, and several times on sabbaticals in different parts of the world.
Ambassador, as you mentioned, you have had a distinguished career in academia before transitioning to diplomacy. Could you share with us how your academic background influenced your path to diplomacy and what motivated you to make this transition from academia to diplomacy?
Well, actually, the decision to make the transition was not mine. It was made by Prime Minister Rabin, who recruited me to be his chief negotiator with Syria when he was re-elected as Israel's Prime Minister in 1992. He chose me primarily because I am a historian of Syria, among other things. Secondly, I had the think tank experience, not diplomatic, but think tank and policy. In that regard, policy analysis more than actually practice of policy. I knew Washington. I was there in Washington on sabbaticals before that. So he thought I was the right person to conduct the negotiations with Syria and eventually also to become his ambassador to Washington.
It's a fascinating story, Ambassador. As chief negotiator with Syria in the mid-1990s, I believe that you faced some difficulties. Especially, I remember when you taught us in class last year that your counterparts were a bit unwilling to negotiate or tough. So I believe this kind of job requires a high level of diplomatic soft skills. And I was wondering if you remember something from that time when you were negotiating, or a story or an anecdote.
Oh yeah, so first it was a very difficult, tough negotiation. I mean, the ruler of Syria at the time, Hafez al-Assad, was a very tough man. And obviously, he controlled every detail of his side of the negotiations. I could feel that the Syrian delegation to the talks was echoing their president. And in their view, symbols were very important. For instance, when I came to the negotiations, there was an earlier round under the previous government that preceded Rabin. There were no handshakes because in their language you do not shake hands with the enemy. when time came for the coffee break, when we were meeting in the State Department building, the Syrian delegation would rush out of the room and go to their office because, again, according to them, you do not break bread with the enemy. Their concept of negotiation was very simple, that you must get off the Golan Heights, which you captured illegally in 1967. So therefore tell us, to begin with, that you are committed to withdraw fully from the Golan, and then we can talk also about what peace means. So both on the symbolic level and the substantive level, it was a very difficult negotiation, and I had to invest efforts in the beginning to break the ice. So I managed to get a handshake with my counterpart in the first meeting. I must say that they did welcome me because, first of all, they thought that Rabin wanted to make a deal, and they were correct. And secondly, they appreciated the fact that he chose a historian of Syria to negotiate, which, to quote Hafiz al-Assad, this was a sign of seriousness. And so the atmosphere actually was better to begin with. And I brought with me a book that I wrote on the peace negotiations in 1949, 1950, including with Syria, that failed, called The Road Not Taken. And I dedicated it to my counterpart, writing in, I hope that this time the road will be taken. I gave him the book, I extended my hand, he shook my hand, and that was step number one in breaking the ice. Step number two was to persuade the Syrians to stay for the coffee break with us and begin to have a human conversation. So I had with me a small bag of elite Turkish coffee from Israel. And when time came for the coffee break, I asked the Syrians to stay, and I said, how about having some Middle Eastern coffee here? And they stayed, and we shared Turkish coffee, and from that point on, they stayed in the room for the coffee break, and then you can have a little bit of a human, normal conversation. So all these small issues seem very petty with regard to the big issue of the future of the Golan Heights and security arrangements and great power involvement. But in the practice of diplomacy, in order to get the negotiation and to get to the big questions, you have to break the ice on these relatively minor issues in relatively minor ways.
So maybe major changes start with minor changes first, we can say, in this regard.
The Chinese say even a walk across the globe begins with one step.
Yeah, true. Thank you very much for sharing this insights. Now let's shift our focus to a broader perspective on diplomacy, because I know, Ambassador, you've met influential figures, as you said, Yitzhak Rabin, or you once told me, I think, Henry Kissinger was also a friend of yours, or you got to know him. And I think those people shaped international politics. And as you have some kind of personal experience with them, do you recall some memories with them or some issues, some skills they all had in common a diplomat must have in this regard or in this sense?
Yeah, actually you mentioned Henry Kissinger and Yitzhak Rabin. That's interesting because they were friends. Actually, Rabin, after the Six-Day War, when he was chief of staff of the victorious Israeli army, asked the prime minister at the time to send him to Washington as ambassador because he wanted to prepare himself for political life, and he wanted to understand the world, international relations, thought Washington was the right place, and he was sent there, and he became very friendly with Kissinger, who took him under his wings and in a way became his mentor, both in international diplomacy and in American politics. And what he said about him was that presumably he was the most unlikely diplomat because he was very blunt, straight-spoken, not what you normally associate with what we call diplomatic style, always very subtle, indirect, and so forth. Rabin was very direct. As I said, could be blunt, but he was a very smart man, understood politics, strategic affairs, had a very good concept of both Israeli politics and security needs and the international arena, and he knew how to shape a foreign policy. He didn't have to be a diplomatic, quote-unquote, by himself. And you wanted an anecdote from Rabin. So one day there was a hitch in the negotiations. We had the Secretary of State Christopher visiting Jerusalem. There was a difficult meeting in the evening. There was to be another one in the next morning. And a group of us, Rabin's aides, met at his residence in Jerusalem. And Rabin remembered a particular clause in the 1974 Israeli-Syrian disengagement agreement. Now, we are now not in 74, we are now in 1994, let's say 22 years later. No, 20 years later. So, in any event, so I was the Syria expert, but he remembered it, but he wasn't sure. So he wanted the text of the 1974 Israeli-Syrian disengagement agreement. We were in Jerusalem. The text was in Tel Aviv. So they had to send for someone to take it out from a particular place in the Ministry of Defense and bring it to his home in Jerusalem, which took about almost 2 hours. And it was in the evening, maybe 10 p.m. by that point. So we said to Rabin, why don't you go and take a rest and we'll wait? And he said, no, as long as you're waiting here, I'll wait with you. Then, so two things about that. One, he was very human. He said, nice to the people who worked with him. But secondly, he also remembered correctly from 20 years earlier. So that was Rabin.
That makes leadership too, you mean?
Yeah, it's, leadership can be acquired in many ways. Rabin had, his leadership was not based on charisma. He was not particularly a charismatic leader, and he was not, as eloquent as, he was not a great speaker, public speaker, but he had authority. He was, as Minister of Defense in the 1980s, as the victorious Chief of Staff in 1967, the Israeli public came to see him as Mr. National Security. And he built his, he was very credible to the public. For instance, if there would be an incident and some Israeli soldiers would be killed in South Lebanon, he would go on television and begin by saying, as Minister of Defense, I am responsible. That type of straightforwardness and honesty built his position among the Israeli public, gave him that authority, even though he was not, quote-unquote, charismatic.
Yeah. Interesting. Thank you, Mr. Ambassador, but I just want to ask a small political question, if you allow me, because of these recent developments in the Middle East, especially after October 7th. You've been an advocate for the two-state solution for Israel and Palestine. You're still, okay. So that's actually the question. Do you still believe that this two-state solution is still viable, or is it dead?
No, it's not dead, and it's not viable today. It can be viable, quote-unquote, tomorrow. That is to say, the Palestinian Authority, which as a result of the Oslo Accords is the not sovereign but governing authority in the West Bank, was in Gaza until Hamas threw it out in 2007. Today it has an old leader. It has a leadership that is considered to be corrupt and inefficient. and people who have been there too long. It needs to undergo a reform, and when it does that, it could be again a partner, because we need, Israel cannot continue or wish to govern the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, and because we will have at this point practically an equal number of Palestinians and Israelis west of the Jordan, and given the birth rates among the Palestinians in 20 years, they would have a majority, and Israel would have to make a choice whether it wants to be democratic or Jewish. And I think the answer to that choice is that to have a two-state solution and keep Israel both Jewish and democratic.
Jewish and democratic.
Right.
Right. Thank you, Ambassador. As we near to the end of our interview, I'd like to ask you a couple of final questions. The first one is, you mentioned that you recently joined your wife in learning German, right. I think last year or 2 years ago.
Right.
And at a stage in life where many people actually tend to relax and overcome all those problems from the past, what motivated you to take this new challenge, which is actually a challenge when we speak about the German language? It's not like English, right?
No, it's actually I study German, and I say trying to perfect myself in French. I mean, my French is reasonable, but I want it to be better. So I'm also studying French. But I study German. First of all, it's a very important exercise for the mind. You want to keep your mind exercised. Second, my wife and I have a place in Vienna, and I'm now coming regularly to the Diplomatic Academy to teach a short course. And I can manage in German, but I'd like to really have a good command of German. So this explains the decision. And also about, relaxing. I mean, I used to work very, very hard most of my life, very long days. I don't. I mean, I continue to work, but not long days. We travel. We have vacations. We go out. So I do need. I mean, I need an intellectual challenge at all times. It be studying language or writing. So I know there's a copy of one of my books here. I finished another one published last year, and I'm at work on another one. Wow. So I do need that challenge.
That's really interesting, because I also wanted to ask you, because it's a traditional question. We asked it in our last memoir too, to Ambassador Brink, and that's the one on a more reflective note, because I think that you're going to write a memoir. So if you were about to write a memoir, what would be the title, you think?
Well, actually, I did make a decision not to write a memoir.
Not to write a memoir. No, it's very unfortunate.
I'll tell you why. Because I think there's a point to writing a memoir if you're going, quote unquote, to tell it all. About the events you participated in, and about the people you met and worked with. Now, not all people I worked with on the Israeli side, on the American side, I'd say were perfect. I'd have to be critical. I think it's awkward and unbecoming to work with someone for a couple of years, 3 years, and then write negatively in the memoir. It won't work for me. And to write a sort of a self-censored memoir makes no point. Yeah. So I keep the book. You have here a book on my Syrian negotiations. Yeah.
Which you signed already.
It's not a memoir. It's really an analysis of a narrative and analysis of the negotiation. Mm-hmm. But all the minor interesting details, some of which we mentioned today, I keep, when people are interested, we talk about it, I tell them, I share it sometimes with my students, that's fine. But I don't go beyond that.
Thank you for sharing with us too. Now we have your memoir.
Oh, okay.
Ambassador Rabinovich, thank you so much for joining us. Wish you a very nice Vienna experience for this year.
Thank you.
Thank you.